Good morning, everybody. I am Paulina Granado Zambrano, Executive Secretary of the International Organization of Pension Fund Supervision Agencies, IOS, and the Head of Research of the Superintendents of Pensions of Chile.
Well, it is now my pleasure to introduce our first guest, Laura Ripani. Her presentation focuses on how to achieve equity in pensions and why gender matters. Laura Ripani is a labor market and social security division chief at the Inter-American Development Bank. She specializes in labor markets with a focus on improving job opportunities for all. Laura has been published extensively in academic journals in the fields of labor markets, education, and social safety nets. With over 20 years of experience, Laura has built a broad network of international contacts in government, the private sector, and academia, and has become a leading voice on the future of work. Before joining the bank, the IDB, she worked at the World Bank on projects related to poverty and labor markets in Latin America and the Caribbean. She holds a PhD and a master's in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and an undergraduate degree and master's in economics from the National University of La Plata. Laura, the floor is all yours. At the 2-minute mark from your end, you're going to hear a little bell just to let you know that we're coming close to the end. Thank you very much, Paulina, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm going to share my screen here. Just want to share this presentation I prepared for today. Thank you for having me. Now, the presentation for today focuses on gender equality in pensions. As we all know, throughout the life cycle, women get less paid work. They have lower pay and also have lower access to formal employment compared to men. This is why in the region, women get a smaller pension when they retire. The conversation today has actually grown very much because of the impact we've seen from COVID-19 and the labor market gap. This is something that we are very concerned about. We know that the pandemic has had a strong impact on inequality, and that has also increased gender inequality. The question we ask is how we can address this gap and what adjustments are needed in current pension systems in order to move in the right direction. In order to address these questions, I broke up my presentation into 3 different segments. The first segment will focus on the impact of the pandemic in the labor market, focusing specifically on the impact in terms of gender gap. The second segment will focus on showing what the implications of all of this is in the labor market and also when it comes to pension equity. And the last segment will focus on just some final thoughts on how we can take those steps forward. The first part then is going to be on the impact of the pandemic when it comes to the labor market gap. Now, what do we know given our household surveys and also surveys on social safety net? Here we see the household survey data. And what we see is that the loss of employment in Latin America and the Caribbean has been absolutely dramatic. 30 million jobs were lost. That's 14% of total employment. And there has been recovery of about half of those jobs, but there is still a long road ahead. As we can see on this graph here, we see how employment has evolved over time from 12 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the drop was very sharp through June, July 2020. And then that recovery I mentioned starts to pick up. However, these changes mask great differences between different segments of the population. One of these segments is women. They have been disproportionately affected by job loss. Since February 2020, 17% of jobs were lost specifically for women compared to 12% for men. In addition to this, recovery when it comes to work for women has been slower. As of 2020, we see that job loss was still more of an impact for women compared to what was seen in men. Some preliminary data highlights that the COVID-19 pandemic led to the loss of almost 10 years of gains in terms of women's workforce participation. We know that prior to the pandemic, the region had taken significant strides in increasing women's workforce participation, but this backsliding is a huge loss for progress that had been achieved for women when it comes to work. As a matter of fact, women's labor force participation fell by 6.4 percentage points in 2020 compared to 2019 in the region, while the drop for men was only 1.1 percentage points. This has to do with a number of factors, and they have to do with the industries where women generally work, having to do more of the household work and unpaid work, and also facing bigger gaps when it comes to using technology and digital skills. And I'll talk about these specifically on the next few slides. With regard to the first factor, the industries most affected by the pandemic were the ones that employ most women, like housing and food service. As we see on this graph, around the world, women account for 54% of work in accommodations and food service compared to 39% of their average workforce participation in the economy. 43% of jobs in trade and 43% in other services like art, recreation, and public administration. This high degree of participation in the sectors that were harder hit by the pandemic because of the lockdown and because things were closed down for services, and also because of the loss in tourism, has had a significant impact on women and their work. What this shows is that women's employment is at a risk that is 19% higher than men during that same period, given the breakdown by industry. With regard to the second factor, and that is that women in the region dedicate more time to household work and unpaid work, what we see is that women in the region actually dedicate 3 times more time to this kind of work than men do. As a matter of fact, throughout the world, women do most of the unpaid work at home, but in Latin America and the Caribbean, this distribution of tasks is even more unequal. In our region, on average, women handle 73% of unpaid work in household, while men account for the 27% remaining. As a comparison, in Sweden, women's contribution to domestic work and childcare is 56%. In the United States, this is 62%. As a matter of fact, ECLAC estimates that women in our region work around 54 hours a week, which is almost 3 full hours more than men do. However, only 19 hours are paid. In other words, only 35% of all of the time dedicated, while for men, paid hours account for 74% of all of the time worked. Now, let's look at the third factor, which we also believe plays an important role, seeing what characterized the pandemic with the increase in digitalization and the use of technology to increase job opportunities in the technology sector. The third factor has to do with the fact that women face deeper and larger gaps in digital skills and use of technology, which are absolutely essential when we think about job recovery and quality of work. In this regard, and according to one of the articles on the series, The Future of Work in Latin America and the Caribbean from the IDB, the gender gap in access to ICTs mainly benefits men. And here we have evidence of what's happening in the region, and this gap goes from 1% to 18% in some countries. This is what we can see on the left. Now, once men and women do gain access to technology, the evidence shows that women have more limited use of digital devices and the internet, and this includes the digital economy. This lag in basic digital skills and really limits the women's ability to gain access to all of the benefits that can stem from technology. And all of this in addition to the existing pay gap. On this graph, we see that pay for women in the region on average are 26% below men's. The largest gaps can be found in Mexico, Peru, and Paraguay at about 40%. And this gap actually translates into significant differences in future revenue and income for women when they retire, because as they receive lower pay, they also contribute less to their social safety nets and therefore their savings for old age. All of this highlights the equality issues that we see in labor markets in our region. And what is the concern? Well, this inequality in labor markets in the region turns into inequality in accessing pension systems. In the second part here, we're going to look at the larger and bigger challenges they are facing in this regard. Women face bigger challenges in pension systems, both in the accumulation phase as well as in the disaccumulation phase. This has to do with the structural challenges that have to do with coverage, with support for senior citizens, for the larger part of the population, the adequacy component, meaning that the pension actually allows for decent living conditions at that time in life, and also sustainability for the benefits of the pensions to be able to be funded not only now, but also later. We saw the numbers regarding lower pay. Now let's see what happens when it comes to contribution density. There were a number of studies conducted in the region on contribution density, and they revealed that women tend to be in the lower density contribution segment, where most men are in higher contribution density segments. The gaps in this density indicator goes from 5 to 15%. That is the gap. Some of the factors that explain these results are some of the ones we have already mentioned, but that bear repeating. They have to do with quality and participation in the workforce. For example, longer periods of being unemployed, additionally, also more participation in the informal sector, and also working in a part-time position. When it comes to part-time positions, women do more part-time work proportionally compared to men. In OECD countries, as we can see on this graph, on average, 25% of women working had a part-time job in 2019 compared to 7% of men. In our region, we have seen significant differences in countries like Costa Rica, where 31% of working women were doing part-time work compared to 11% in men. And we also see significant differences in countries like Colombia, where the percentages are 27% for women compared to 9% for men. This can actually exacerbate gender inequality and have women working in lower paid employment and also have fewer opportunities in the labor market compared to men. That sort of participation could increase as labor markets continue to disproportionately reward those who want to and can work as many hours as necessary, which mostly means men. In terms of the disaccumulation, as we know, women live longer. As a matter of fact, according to UN numbers in our region, women who turn 60 have a life expectancy of an additional 23 years, while men are expected to live an additional 20 years. And all of this is in addition to the structural and systemic challenges of the aspects we mentioned before: coverage, adequacy, and sustainability. In terms of coverage, on the left, we see that there is a higher concentration in men. As a matter of fact, on average, only 32% of women over 65 in the region have a contributory pension. This percentage is below the 41% we see in men. In other words, there is a gap that is close to 9%. On the right, we see that this gap is offset by non-contributory pensions, which mainly concentrates a larger amount of women. What we see in this case is that the gap on the right is only 4%. In other words, this is not enough to offset the losses from the contributory component. With regard to the amounts of contributory pensions over the last few years, we have seen a decrease in the gender gap, on average 19% in the 5-year period, 2015-2019. However, the persistence of pay disparity and having fewer women doing paid work will not allow for these gaps to really be fully addressed in a way that corrects the problem. In a number of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are differentiated approaches for retirement age. This means that women tend to retire earlier. This is despite the fact that they live longer, as we saw in the last slide. This compounds the sustainability challenges in these pension systems because it means that there needs to be more pension subsidies and challenges when it comes to the sustainability of pension systems. This here is the data we have for retirement age across different countries in the region and the differences. Lastly, as I wrap up my presentation, I wanted to share just a few thoughts for the region. There are 3 main takeaways that I would like to leave you with. The first is that closing the pension gender gap requires, first and foremost, addressing the labor market gap when it comes to the gender inequality. If we don't close the gender gap in the labor market, we cannot have an equitable pension system. We also need to make sure that we have quality employment offered to women. Another issue that we need to work on more in the region has to do with flexible time and job approaches. There is a lot of work to do in reviewing labor laws and to ensure that there is a social contract and an actual conversation with the public where we can find the best solution. Another important aspect are care policies to ensure that women can get better access to the labor market. This will require addressing who takes care of children and the elderly. As we saw before, a big part of this work mainly falls on women. Lastly, skills investing to ensure that women can get better access to the quality jobs that are starting to come on the market. As I mentioned before, these gaps need to be closed, and I'm referring to the digital skills gap, so that women can actually take advantage of the jobs that are being created in technology. Everything I've mentioned needs to be accompanied by steps that can help reduce this gap in pension systems. One of these steps could be to actually make systems more flexible in order to address the part-time schemes issue, as well as lower pay for women. A second strategy for pension systems has to do with implementing pension saving strategies through tech tools and also using the behavioral economics theory. Mixing psychology and financial products, which are part of this behavioral economics theory, are going to be key when designing user-friendly incentives. I would encourage you all to actually visit the retirement lab. This is a project that the IDB has been spearheading for a number of years. And there are a number of lessons to learn when it comes to how to better promote these user-friendly incentives. The last has to do with gender neutral retirement policies, and that can include a step like, for example, having men and women who have the same pension savings actually receive the same pension upon retirement, or also take into account other factors. Now, in closing, I would like to mention something that is also important. This is something that can help us also continue to make headway in closing the gender gap. We need assurance systems that are equitable and even for all. And that requires working on some key aspects of these systems, like, for example, making sure that the reforms that take place are complex because these issues are not simple. Over these last few days of the seminar, we have learned that these are complex issues. Therefore, the solution should also be complex. Having access to the labor market, as well as increasing formal work for those in the workforce in order to have broader coverage. Lastly, making sure that pension systems have the appropriate institutional foundation. Pension agencies need to get support in order to be robust and resilient enough to take on the challenges we're facing. So this last component here, when it comes to these institutions and agencies for pensions, it's important to highlight that bringing these systems online and digitalizing these processes is important. And this is something the bank is heavily supporting in the region. So with that, I would like to close this presentation. I believe that this is just before my time ran out, and that should give us more time for a Q&A with our audience. Thank you very much. Laura, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. And I do have to say that you have given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of things we would like to talk about when it comes to gender inequality. We have gotten a lot of questions that have come in, so I'll try to gather them around a couple of key issues. The first question is this. I know that there was no mention of age inequality, and so we know that women as a group were more affected by the pandemic, but the public policy to be implemented for young women would be very different from other age groups. It has a lot to do with what you mentioned, improving access to the labor market and what happens throughout the working life cycle. The second segment here, for women over 50, for example, or closer to retirement age, they were also hit with this huge COVID produced shock, but the steps necessary in that case are very different. So here's the question. What is your recommendation to address this specific shock felt by women who are close to retirement, particularly when they are working with defined contribution pension plans? How to address the shock? Well, I think that this is going to depend on how the labor market challenges are resolved. That's key for the pensions challenge. I think it's important to bring women back into the labor market, making sure that the jobs they get are of the best quality possible. That's absolutely key. When we see women who are still in the early part of their working life, making sure that there is investment in their skills and training so that they can have the most effective and swift integration into the labor market, that's absolutely vital. But once women hit 50 or older, we need to see whether there can be more investment done for reskilling. In other words, addressing the skills side of what can help them come back into the labor market. And if that can be done independently and not with dependence on anything, that could also help increase pension savings. And this is why in the presentation we talked about not only fixing the issues in the contributory systems, but also addressing the fact that women work in the informal sector, but also for self-employed women to make sure that they have the savings they need that they can do as self-employed workers.
And that's what we were talking about when we were mentioning these nudges, these little ways of incentivizing people so that they will save on their own. That's very important. So any aspect that you're working on, whether it's formal or informal, try to improve income through better work for skills or skilled workers, improving skills, and making sure that people who are self-employed make their contributions and save for their old age. All that is very important. So from all these various perspectives, we have to still understand that we don't all work from 9 to 6 every day of the week anymore. There are different ways to work. And everyone needs to think about saving for their retirement. It's very important. And for women, as we showed earlier, it's extremely important to be aware of this and for them to receive the support of the public sector through those tools that can help them save in this way. I have a couple of questions about having equal pensions for women and for men, and this is related to what you said. We need to have unisex mortality tables. And here's another question. In Chile, there's a debate on pension systems, and there's a proposal for a basic universal pension. Will this correct part of that gender inequality? And that's part of the question, but there's another part of it, and I want to include it in this question. With defined contribution system, if we had unisex tables, who pays for the deficit that arises when you have perhaps life expectancy statistics for women that are not accurate? Well, regarding the universal basic pension, that could be a step forward. And when we talk about non-contributory pensions, it's the same idea. People need to have a certain income in their old age. That's essential. As I said earlier, many women don't reach that level of the basic universal pension because a lot of the work they do is not paid, it's not remunerated, and so they don't make contributions to their social security, but they've done the work. So that would be a way for the state to compensate within the pension system by providing this universal basic pension. I think it's an interesting idea from the point of view of what our colleague from Chile was alluding to. Regarding the deficit, who pays? These questions are always difficult to answer. It's going to depend on the country, on the tax system of that country, what sort of social contract each country has, and how these differences can be made up for. That depends on the country, maybe through a general tax, or perhaps there's another way to make up for the difference that's found within the system. If it's robust enough from a financial perspective, then that would be ideal, but very often that's not the case. And we need to resort to other approaches, other types of tax that are outside of the pension contributions, but that depends on the country. It's unique to each country, and each country will have to find its own solution. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for these changes that need to be made in order to adequately compensate women for their work. Next question, what do you think about adjustments to pension systems where the state compensates women while women are, for example, taking care of newborn children? Yes, thank you for that question. I think that is a positive development, and many European countries are in fact already implementing something like this. And many are already compensating women for those care services that they provide to the children, and that is a social benefit that they're providing. And this is an acknowledgement, as I was saying earlier, that that unpaid work component of women is real, and recognizing, acknowledging that work is something important, in my opinion. So if in the region we start to apply these lessons learned from Europe, having to the idea of recognizing this unpaid work in raising children, I think this is a positive development. Not many countries in the region are acknowledging this, though, so it would be uh, a learning curve for the region as well. How can we introduce this idea? What scope would it have? For what number of children would we be able to provide these benefits? What's the limits? And these are also decisions that need to be made individually in each system according to the level of financial strength of the country's systems. It's not useful to be naive about it and think that we can do everything that we want in terms of improving gender equality in our system. Sometimes we have financial limitations, financial constraints that we need to pay attention to, but we can experiment, and according to our analysis of what we've done afterwards, then we can perhaps expand one of these mechanisms if we're trying it. Your microphone is muted, Paulina. Yes, I'm sorry. Do you have any examples of countries that have implemented measures of this type? Well, as I was saying, a lot of the northern countries in Europe, for example, have implemented mechanisms of this kind, and they're rather original at this point, perhaps rather unique. And we know that gender equality has always been a priority for these Nordic countries, but I really see this as an interesting element to pay attention to in our region as well, if we want to have a population that has coverage in their old age, and in particular, if we're talking about women. So these are lessons learned, and it's not just always a matter of copy pasting. We need to take into account that we have a different system, different conditions, different levels of informality in the economy. So how can we apply these measures in countries like Bolivia or Guatemala, and maybe not the same as we would see in Argentina, Chile, or Brazil? We have another question from the audience. According to the graph, Brazil, Peru, and Argentina have the smallest gaps in the region. What are these countries doing correctly regarding unpaid work? Well, as I was saying earlier, perhaps there are certain structural aspects in the labor market that create these differences. Maybe more people in the formal sector in terms of labor, more people enjoying the benefits of working in the formal economy. This might have something to do with the size of the gaps compared perhaps to countries where there is a higher level of labor informality. And perhaps there's a greater participation of women in these informal markets, as we know many women are part of the informal labor market. So that tends to widen those gaps. So that would be a good aspect to investigate, but not the only one. In terms of different roles regarding household chores, etc., we have a certain history, perhaps coming from our ancestors or our older adults, and maybe it's been changing in the younger generations, but there's still a difference. There's still an imbalance. And you showed a very interesting graph that showed the proportion of unpaid household work done by women as compared to men. We don't want to make it the opposite, of course. We just want to make it more equal, right? For men also to do their fair share of that unpaid work. So I know, I think we've made some progress in the last 30 years, but perhaps we have not made enough progress. However, if I compare my husband to my grandfather, I see that we have changed the paradigms a bit, that women as well as men, domestic chores, household chores should be divided equally, but perhaps if we could reduce that to a minimum or reduce the proportion of it that is unpaid, that would help. Domestic workers in private homes are also affected by this. In gender literature, we see how important all these types of transfers are. So what can you tell us about this aspect? Yes, great question, Paulina. I think what you are saying is absolutely true. What's most important is having access to quality care services for children as well as for senior citizens. It's not just raising children, it's also senior care. And this affects us in particular in our region, as our region is aging at a faster rate than before. So promoting these quality care services at a level that is affordable for most of the population is a very significant challenge we're facing in the region. And it's something that we still owe our societies. It's a social good that we still have to achieve. And if we free up some of those restrictions, eliminate some of those obstacles, and people can have access to affordable quality care, I think the level of satisfaction and happiness in homes will increase, and it will help free some of those women who do not work out in the labor market because they have to work at home. And it would help men also be able to participate in labor activities as well and know that their children are well taken care of and their parents or grandparents or uncles, whoever, is also receiving excellent quality care. I think that's a very important policy. And as you were saying, sometimes we focus a lot on care policies and talk about making women able to work, but we should talk about letting all workers be able to go to work with peace of mind, knowing that their families are well taken care of. And it's not just about care centers. There are different modes of child care. There can be community arrangements. There can be people who go to a family's house and provide that service. As long as we're promoting the idea that all people who work in the care sector need to enjoy good working conditions, they need to be able to make contributions to Social Security, have health insurance, etc. And as you were saying, this is something we need to continue working on in the region, trying to provide support to people in the care sector so they also can have access to better quality jobs. The idea of how to finance these policies again comes up. You, of course, said this depends on the situation in each country, but is there something we can do differently? Because everything you are saying depends on a social network of social services that is more universal in nature, more affordable. So I don't know if the private sector could help with some initiatives. Perhaps we don't have the necessary robustness still in our systems in the region to do it otherwise. And we are just in the last couple of minutes of our conversation here. Well, yes, Paulina, I think we need to assess all financing options and all types of public private partnerships that we can have. That's why I mentioned community arrangements as well in certain places, in certain areas or regions. Perhaps there's a community where people can support each other so that some members of the community can go out to work. There are examples of successful community arrangements of this kind. That's not a government program as such. It's not being funded through taxes, but the care services are being provided. And beyond expanding the pie, we also have to see how we distribute it. So efficiency in the use of public resources, anything that can be freed up in order to improve efficiency is going to be crucial. And as I said, it's still a debt that we owe to our societies, this early childhood care. We didn't focus on it when we needed to. Perhaps we focused on other issues that also needed attention, but this is still on the table. It's still pending. And it's very important. Perhaps now we need to not flip our priorities, but make sure that we do deal with this one. And well, we have obviously the sources of funding that we all know, public resources, but we, other than that, public-private arrangements, community arrangements, and perhaps increasing the resources that are allocated to this sector that was not prioritized earlier, despite its importance.